There are so many interesting people doing interesting things in our city that we rarely have any guests appear more than once on our show. But tonight, we're welcoming back someone we had the pleasure of interviewing a couple of years ago because with the publication of his new book, Steve Paikin has given us much more to talk with us about. Steve's new book is the first official biography of Ontario's most revered former Premier, William Davis, a man we had the privilege of interviewing on Toronto Files last season. As the host of The Agenda on TVO and one of the most respected journalists in our province today, Steve is well known to all of us and requires little in the way of further introduction. So welcome, Steve.
Thank you. I did see your show with Bill Davis, and I was wondering how you got him, because he's notorious for not wanting to do TV interviews.
Well,
we were very flattered.
Yeah.
And listen, welcome from me, too.
Yes,
nice to see you. Nice to have you back here on our set. And let's talk about your book. It's called Bill Davis, Nation Builder, and Not So Bland After All. And you know, I don't think most people would realize this, but 2/3 of Ontario's population was born after Bill Davis retired from politics in 1985. So, before we go any further, perhaps we should ask you just to tell a lot of our audience, assuming they're younger people, exactly who Bill Davis is and was, and what you mean by not so bland after all.
Sure, and I think that's a great place to start, because it is true. He's been out of the public eye for 30 years, which is amazing, because it just feels like yesterday that he was premier. Look, Bill Davis was one of our most successful premiers ever. I think it doesn't matter what side of the political fence you're on, people would say that. He's the last guy to win 4 straight elections. No one won 4 straight elections until World War I before him. He was a very successful premier in terms of electoral support. If you look around a lot of Ontario today, we have a lot of what we have because Bill Davis was where he was. He was education minister for almost a decade in the 1960s before he became premier. So what did we get there? We got the community college system, we got TVO, we got OISE, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, and then he became the second longest serving premier ever in Ontario history, 1971 to 85, and his fingerprints are just on so much of what we have in the province today, and I've been bugging him for so long to do an interview, and I'm glad he finally said yes.
Yeah, we are too. So you say right off the bat in your book that you still think of this province 30 years later as Bill Davis's Ontario. What do you mean by that?
We're a moderate place. At the end of the day, we're a moderate place. I think if you look back at the last Ontario election, when the Progressive Conservative Party, which ran on a not very progressive but very conservative platform, unlike Mr. Davis, who always ran on a progressive conservative platform, he loved to straddle that big middle of the political spectrum. You know, 70% of the people who voted in the last election voted against a kind of hard right agenda that the Conservatives in that election put forward. And it just seemed to me, and that's how I started the book, with the 2014 election, not actually with one of his elections, because it occurred to me that we're still in many ways a moderate Bill Davis style province of Ontario. And the reference to the bland in the title, you know, they once asked him, why do you run such a bland government? And he said, bland works. Okay. And that was true. I mean, I think it was true back then. And if you look today, a lot of our politicians get into a lot of trouble sometimes when they try to do too much, too fast. I mean, we're seeing Kathleen Wynne's government get into that kind of trouble. And she's trying to sort of put the brakes on things.
So she could use a little bland?
Well, I think he understood that a lot of times, as he used to like to say, you don't get in trouble for the speeches you don't give or the positions you don't take.
Very true. You also refer to him as a nation builder, but he was a provincial politician, so how did he influence the country as a whole?
There's no question in my mind that the Constitution and the Charter of Rights, which we have today, which was repatriated in 1981, led by the current Prime Minister's father, Pierre Trudeau, would not have happened had Bill Davis not been Premier of Ontario at the time. He made, and I won't go into it here because it's in the book, he made a crucial call to Pierre Trudeau at a key moment in all of the negotiations, which before this book was really not known by the public at all, that saved the day. And the whole thing, I'm convinced, would have collapsed at that moment had Bill Davis not taken that important step at that key moment and save the day. Now, he won't get any credit for that. You know, when they had the big signing ceremony in Ottawa, it was Pierre Trudeau and Jean Chrétien, a bunch of other federal people up on the stage with the Queen signing it, and he was sitting in the rain in the audience with all the other premiers. But the reality is, he was an indispensable element to making it happen, and I'm glad this book finally tells the story and gives him his due. That's why he's a nation builder.
Right.
You know, Steve, it's pretty common for politicians to write their memoirs today, or at least some sort of spin on what they believe they achieved in their time in office, and it's almost within weeks of their leaving office. But Bill Davis resisted the opportunity to put his spin on things, resisted the many requests from many journalists and writers that wanted him to tell his story until 30 years later, and you managed to persuade him to do it. How did you do that?
I think, first of all, there were a couple of very sensible reasons why he delayed for so long. Number one, he's a very modest guy. And his parents drummed it into him, you know, when he was growing up in Brampton, Ontario, back in the 1930s and 40s. Modesty in all things, William, you know. So he didn't feel the massive ego requirement to sort of tell his story. The other thing is, and he talks about this in the book for the first time ever in any kind of public way, Bill Davis had a horrible tragedy that happened in his life. In his early 30s, he's lost his wife. His wife died of cancer, his first wife, in his early 30s, left him with 4 kids under the age of 6. And I think a huge part of him just did not want to have to go back and revisit all of that, as you would for a book. And it took a long time for him to be comfortable enough discussing this with somebody else. So I think that was all part of it. Eventually, I think I was able to persuade him because I tried to guilt him into it in some respects.
But he trusted you enormously, obviously.
I hope that was the case, and I hope I hope the story has done justice to. I hope the book has done justice to his story. But at the end of the day, he got elected for the first time in 1959. I mean, Leslie Frost was the premier. It's a long time ago. Yeah. And I told him, you know, you've got a duty to history to not take all that knowledge that's in your head and take it to your grave, which hopefully won't be for many, many, many more years. And I think eventually
that appeal to his altruism worked.
Hopefully at the end of the day, that was persuasive.
A sense of history. Yeah. Tell me, are there any surprising revelations in this book from Bill Davis, or any kind of inside dope that most people wouldn't have known?
There is, and I kind of resist telling it to you right now because
you want people to buy the books.
Well, not only that, but I think there's a...
Well, just give us one juicy tidbit.
Well, all right, I told you one already, the story in the Constitution, which is a never-told-before story. Again, all of the tragedy around the death of his first wife. I think there's a lot of sort of internal stuff about when he ran the government of Ontario for those 14 years. A lot of the behind-the-scenes stuff that obviously at the time people are not going to talk about, but with the passage of, I mean, he won his first election 45 years ago, right? His first election as premier 45 years ago. So with the passage of time, I think people have felt more comfortable spilling some of those beans, and some of those beans are in the book.
Okay, well, we'll just all have to read the book, as we are doing now. It's pretty clear that writing this book was a labor of love for you, and that's because you are such a devotee of Ontario politics and Ontario's history, but also you have a very special feeling for your subject, William Davis. Tell us about what it was like to actually be able to write about the man you so admired, and that in turn I think admires you.
I think that's a good word to use, admire. I did and do admire him for a couple of reasons. Number one, he became premier when I was 10, and he stopped being premier when I was 24. So all of my most formative years growing up in the province of Ontario were his most formative years in political life. So he was a big deal when I was growing up. So that's number one. Number two, you know, the opportunity to spend a lot of time with him for the purpose of this book. And of course, I've interviewed him numerous times over the years for TVO and actually for CBC before that, where I used to work. But we spent a lot of time together in Brampton, in Toronto, at his condo in Florida, at his fantastic cottage on Georgian Bay, which is the place, I think, in the world where he is happiest, with all his family around him in the most picturesque and beautiful scenery. And yes, I admire his political record, but he's also a man of great humility, humor, accomplishment, and you know, he has so little to be modest about. Right? He has a real great record of achievement, and yet he's still a pretty modest guy at the end of the day. It's almost like he still hears his parents' voice in his ear saying, now, William.
Moderation in all things.
Moderation in all things, exactly. Yeah. So there's all those, I mean, he's not I wouldn't say he's a hero. People have asked me before, is he your hero? No, I don't. I mean, my heroes all play baseball or hockey or something like that. But I do admire his record and himself.
Now, you've written about other political leaders. There was, besides Bill Davis, there's Pierre Trudeau and Peter Lougheed, or another of the Ontario premiers you wrote about was John Robarts. Those individuals seem to be bigger and better politicians, maybe a little larger than life than the ones we're seeing today. Is that our imagination?
Is that just in retrospect that we look at those names?
Partly
or?
yes. Partly yes.
If you were to write about any more current politicians, I don't think they'd come off sounding quite the same.
I don't want to disparage anybody who offers themselves up for public service today, because I wouldn't do it. You may do it someday, but I wouldn't do it. So this is not about criticizing anybody who's in today, but yes, the passage of time helps. And yes, they practiced politics differently back then.
They did.
There was a lot more collegiality. There was a lot less politics of personal destruction. There was a lot more getting to know the people on the other side of the floor. Now, I think maybe things are a little better over the past year. They've moved in a different direction. You know, we're into sunny ways these days and that kind of thing. But that was one of the things. I mean, Bill Davis, one of his best pals in the Ontario legislature, was the leader of the NDP, Stephen Lewis.
Yeah.
Now, you cannot imagine that today.
It just wouldn't happen.
No, it's too vicious and too competitive, and the notion that the premier of the province or the prime minister of the country, one of his or her best pals, would be the leader of one of the other parties. It's hard to imagine today. It was a different time.
True.
You've almost become Ontario's official biographer. As Helen mentioned, you've now written a book about Davis. You wrote about John Robarts. You've written a book about the last 6 or 7 premiers that you've had experience with. And you're also, as we mentioned right off the top, one of Ontario's most respected and best known journalists. Surely people come up to you all the time and say, where do you find the time to do all this and TVO, the agenda? Where do you find the time?
My wife gave me some great advice many years ago, which is, think about it. All that time between midnight and 6 a.m. If you could make that work for you. The reality is, you're right on your summer vacation. You spend your weekends at the Archives of Ontario. And if you want to do these things, and I do apparently have some kind of ridiculous interest in telling these stories, that's when you do it. You do it when you can. And you're right, the agenda is a very full-time job. It's probably a 70, 80-hour-a-week job. Yeah. And then the books get written sort of between 10 and 2 a.m. and on weekends and over the summers, and I enjoy it. And so why not do it?
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's talk about the agenda. Now in its 11th year. Yeah. Very successful still and growing in audience and awareness. Not so for other interview shows. In fact, public affairs in general, I mean, there are shows that come and go, but in Ontario and in Canada, most of them are gone, exactly. So how do you account for the enduring success of the agenda?
We just dare to bore you to death. And by that I mean, one of the things that we have really enjoyed doing is long-form journalism. I mean, in many respects, like you guys do here. It seems that on 500 channels on television, you know, the interviews are 3-4 minutes long. Maybe you'll have a panel discussion that's 12. No.
But you don't get to dig into any
subject.
No,
you don't get any of that. So we just decided years ago that, okay, we're going to have an hour, no commercials every night, and we can divide that hour up any way we want. And we've decided, okay, 1 or 2, maybe 3 topics per show. And that's how we get into considerable depth. And as a result, and particularly, you know, nowadays with podcasts and people watching it on their computers, they can watch it whenever they want or listen to it whenever they want. It just feels like a great fit. And 11th season, and that's 9 more than I thought we'd get, because I started on a 2-year contract and figured, well, let's try this for a couple of years and see what happens, and here we are.
You know, one of the great things about the agenda is it's not just about Ontario politics, even though that is very much your focus personally, but you cover topics that are very international, very global. What are some of the topics that interest you most? Obviously, politics would be one, but what are some of the things that really interest you and also interest your audience?
Jim, I love the show because I have a broad panoply of interests, and I would not want to go to work every single day and only do Ontario politics or only do foreign affairs. I love the fact that on Monday it's something at Queen's Park, On Tuesday, it's foreign affairs. On Wednesday, it's national affairs. On Thursday, it's labor issues. On Friday, it's the economy. Go to the next week, it's something about the brain, science, climate change, social services.
Infinite variety.
Absolutely. It's something different every day. You learn something new every day. You can't get bored doing this job. You're just learning new things all the time.
That's true. And also, you have some great guests. And tell us, who are some of the guests that have inspired you most over the years?
You know, the first name I put at the top of the list is, funnily enough, somebody who doesn't even speak English.
Who's that?
I got to interview Mikhail Gorbachev once upon a time.
Wow.
Now, when you're in the room sitting this far away from Mikhail Gorbachev with a man who, you know, glasnost and perestroika and, you know, helped bring an end to the Soviet Union. I'm of the age where we went to bed at night wondering if the world was going to blow itself up, right? All those nuclear weapons pointed at each other. And Gorbachev was one of the key people to end the Cold War. And I'm sitting 3 feet away from him, talking to him. Now, admittedly through translators, but
still fascinating.
That's a pretty heady moment, I gotta say, yeah. And Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, you know, all the prime ministers, premiers, and that's all pretty interesting stuff.
It is, and have any stuck out in your mind as particularly difficult to interview?
You know, the worst interview I ever did in my life was Mordecai Richler, and I haven't gotten over it yet. And he was on a book tour with a book that, frankly, I don't think he cared that much about. And he came in, and I, you know, went to the green room ahead of time and had a nice conversation with him, tried to sort of ingratiate myself a bit with him, warm him up a bit. We got out into the set, and every answer was a 2- and 3-word answer. I just couldn't. It was like pulling teeth. I couldn't get anywhere. And I knew the interview, I mean, you can feel it when it's going awful in the middle of it, but I knew it was terrible when, as the director cut to the wide shot, he didn't even stick around for that. He ripped his mic off and walked off the show.
Wow.
He couldn't wait to get out of there.
You wonder why.
Well,
you wonder why.
I won't do that to you guys.
Well, thank goodness you were such a good interview, because the time has flown by.
It has.
And thanks for joining us, Steve.
Pleasure to be here.
We'll be
Delighted to
back
have
with
you
more
back.
Toronto Files after this short break.